Crow, the silent mastermind. Razor, his ruthless enforcer. Doyle, the man who handled money like a weapon. These were not just street names, they were the names that made Glasgow tremble. Together, they built the Iron Fists, a gang that rose from back-alley thefts to controlling entire neighborhoods. Their rule was forged in silence, strengthened by fear, and broken only by betrayal. But in the shadows of Scotland's most dangerous streets, even the strongest empire can collapse. In the late 1990s, the city of Glasgow was a place of both beauty and danger. On the surface, it carried its history with pride, with cobblestone streets, historic pubs, and neighborhoods that looked ordinary to an outsider. But beneath that surface, there was a growing darkness. Among the youth who had grown up in poverty and broken families, a hunger for power and respect was rising. Out of this hunger came a group that would soon dominate every whispered conversation in Scotland's underworld. They called themselves the Iron Fists. To most, it sounded like just another street crew, nothing more than a bunch of reckless young men trying to make quick money. But the Iron Fists were different. They had a leader who was far more calculating than anyone expected, a man known only by his street name, Crow. Crow was never loud or flamboyant. He wasn't the type to show off cars, jewelry, or women. He wore plain clothes, kept his circle tight, and spoke very little. But when he did, people listened. Rumor had it he had grown up in the roughest part of the city, watching his own family fall apart from crime and addiction. Unlike others, he wasn't driven only by greed. He wanted control. He wanted to build something that could not be shaken, something that gave him power over both the streets and the people who lived on them. At first, the gang's activities seemed small, almost insignificant. They started by stealing cars, breaking them down for parts, and selling them to mechanics willing to look the other way. They also smuggled cigarettes and alcohol into clubs, avoiding taxes and selling them at prices no one else could compete with. Slowly, these crimes built a steady stream of cash, and with that money, they began to recruit more members. It was Crow's strategy that set them apart from every other group trying to survive in Glasgow at the time. While other gangs picked fights in broad daylight, leaving trails of blood on the streets, Crow preferred silence. He believed violence should be rare, used only when necessary, but when it happened, it should send a message so clear that no one ever questioned the gang again. Those who tried to cheat them, those who thought they could resist paying their share, disappeared. Sometimes bodies were never found. Other times they were left in places where discovery was guaranteed, reminders that the Iron Fists were always watching. By the turn of the millennium, they controlled entire blocks of the city. Shop owners who once feared the police now feared Crow more. They paid fees to the gang, and in return, the Iron Fists promised protection. Of course, this protection was protection from the gang itself. Anyone who refused quickly learned their mistake through smashed windows, stolen goods, or arson. The streets whispered about Crow's men, but no one dared speak loudly. Even when police questioned locals, there was nothing but silence. The fear was too great. Crow's influence reached far beyond the streets. He began bribing officials quietly, slipping money into the right hands so that raids missed their targets and cases disappeared before reaching court. It was as if the Iron Fists were invisible. Police knew they existed, but proving it was another matter. Every witness who could have testified seemed to vanish or suddenly change their story. The rise of the Iron Fists did not happen overnight, but by the early 2000s, it was clear they were no longer just a gang. They were an empire built on intimidation, silence, and careful planning. Crow's name had become a ghostly presence in Glasgow. Few had ever seen him, but everyone claimed to know someone who had. The mystery only made him more powerful. Those who tried to challenge his rule were crushed quickly, and their defeat became a story passed from one pub to the next. The city was slowly being reshaped. Streets that once belonged to local businesses now belonged to the Iron Fists. Warehouses near the river were converted into their storage and meeting grounds. Abandoned flats became safe houses. Crow's men drove through neighborhoods without fear, and the police, despite their best efforts, could never get close enough to make an arrest. To the people living there, the government felt absent, and the Iron Fists felt permanent. In the shadows of Glasgow, a new kind of power had risen, one that cared nothing for the law and everything for control. What started with small thefts and petty smuggling was turning into something no one could have imagined. The Iron Fists were no longer just a group of young men, they were becoming Scotland's most feared gang, and their story was only beginning. By the early 2000s, Glasgow was a city living in quiet fear. The Iron Fists had grown far beyond what anyone expected, and their presence was felt in nearly every corner of the West End. To ordinary people, the gang was like a shadow hovering over daily life, always present, never fully seen, but impossible to ignore. What had started as car thefts and cigarette smuggling had evolved into a network so deeply rooted that even the police struggled to untangle it. Nightclubs, bars, and restaurants were no longer just places for locals to gather. They had become extensions of the gang's empire. Business owners were forced to pay fees for protection, money that was collected weekly by men who never needed to raise their voices or brandish weapons. Everyone already knew what would happen if they refused. Broken windows, stolen deliveries, and fires in the middle of the night were the usual punishments. The message was simple: pay or lose everything. The gang was not reckless in how they spread fear. Crow understood that the appearance of order was as important as violence. The streets under their control remained relatively safe from rival criminals. Petty thieves avoided areas where the Iron Fists operated, not because of the police, but because they knew the consequences of stealing from those under Crow's watch. This twisted form of stability made the gang even harder to fight. Many shopkeepers and club owners despised paying protection fees, yet they admitted in private that the Iron Fists offered more security than the city itself. As money flowed in, the gang expanded their operations. They began importing weapons from Eastern Europe through hidden ports, selling them both to local criminals and to contacts in other parts of the UK. Drugs soon followed. Heroin and cocaine shipments arrived in secret containers, hidden among legitimate goods. With these new streams of income, the Iron Fist's power solidified. Rival gangs were pushed out or absorbed, and within a few years, the streets of Glasgow were known across Scotland as belonging to one gang alone. The violence that accompanied this rise was brutal and deliberate. Shootings erupted in crowded streets, not as accidents, but as warnings. One rival dealer who refused to hand over territory was found dead in his car, the windows shattered by bullets. Another was dragged from his home in front of neighbors, his body later discovered in a burned-out warehouse. Each act was carefully chosen to inspire terror while sending a signal that the Iron Fists were untouchable. The police launched several attempts to strike back. Undercover officers tried to infiltrate the gang, but they rarely lasted long. Somehow, the Iron Fists always seemed to know when an outsider was near. Information was leaking, and suspicions grew that someone within the force was taking bribes. Every time a raid was planned, the gang's warehouses were mysteriously empty. Every time a case reached the courts, witnesses recanted their stories or disappeared altogether. It became a cycle of frustration that left detectives embarrassed and the public convinced the law was powerless. The media seized on the growing chaos. Headlines screamed about the rise of organized crime in Glasgow, and soon, the Iron Fists were no longer just a name whispered in pubs and back alleys. They were called Scotland's Most Gang, a title that struck both fear and fascination into the population. Newspapers described them as a shadow empire with invisible leaders, while television reports speculated about Crow, the mysterious figure pulling the strings. Yet despite the attention, no one could prove anything. Not a single photograph of Crow existed in public records, and his real name remained unknown. The more elusive he became, the more powerful his legend grew. The city itself seemed to bend under this invisible rule. Families warned their children not to linger in certain streets after dark. Taxi drivers avoided particular routes, knowing those areas belonged to the gang. Even pub conversations grew cautious, with men lowering their voices at the mere mention of the Iron Fists. Fear had seeped so deeply into everyday life that people acted as though the gang was a permanent part of the city, as inevitable as the rain or the cold. This grip on Glasgow was not just about money or territory, it was about control. Crow had built an organization that thrived on silence. The police could not touch him, rival gangs could not fight him, and the public dared not resist him. It was an empire built in plain sight, one that transformed Glasgow into a city where every shadow seemed to belong to the Iron Fists, and every heartbeat carried the weight of fear. Behind the walls of secrecy and silence, the Iron Fists were not as unshakable as they seemed. For years, they had operated like a machine, each member knowing his role, each move directed by the cold precision of Crow. From the outside, their empire looked indestructible, but inside the cracks were beginning to spread. Ambition, greed, and suspicion were eating away at the loyalty that had once kept the gang united. It started quietly, almost invisibly, with whispers in backrooms and sidelong glances at meetings. Some of the younger members felt they were risking everything while Crow and his closest circle lived comfortably on the profits. Others believed they deserved a larger share, tired of following orders while their leader's name became a legend. One of these younger men, desperate for more recognition and fearful of being cut out, made the most dangerous choice of all. He began speaking with the police. The officers, beaten down after years of failed raids and disappearing witnesses, saw him as their breakthrough. They offered him protection, money, and the promise of a new life if he could deliver real evidence. At first, his information seemed invaluable. He described shipment routes, warehouse addresses, even the times when Crow's lieutenants would meet. With his help, the police prepared to strike, believing they could finally corner the gang that had humiliated them for so long. The plan was set for a rainy night at the Glasgow docks. A massive drug shipment was supposed to arrive, hidden among cargo containers. Dozens of officers moved in, surrounding the area and searching every container. But when they opened the crates, they found nothing. The drugs were gone, the warehouses empty, and the docks silent except for the sound of rain hitting the concrete. It was a setup. The informant had been exposed before the police ever made their move. Somewhere along the line, the Iron Fists had discovered the betrayal. Days later, his body was found in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The scene was brutal and left no doubt about who was responsible. Scrawled across the wall in jagged letters were the words, "No one escapes the Fists." The discovery shocked even hardened officers, many of whom admitted quietly that they had never seen such a ruthless message left so openly. For the police, the death meant another failure. For the public, it was confirmation that the Iron Fists were untouchable. And for the gang itself, it was a warning. But the murder did not erase the damage. Trust within the Iron Fists had been shattered. Members who once followed orders without hesitation now looked at one another with suspicion. If one man had been willing to betray the gang, who else might be whispering to the police? Crow's lieutenants began questioning each other's loyalty, watching every move with cold eyes. Meetings that once ran with discipline turned tense, silence stretching longer, arguments breaking out over money, territory, and responsibility. The paranoia grew worse as rumors spread. Some claimed that Crow had allowed the betrayal to happen deliberately to test loyalty. Others believed one of the lieutenants had leaked the information to set up a rival within the gang. The truth was never revealed, but the damage was irreversible. What had once been a tightly controlled empire was now splintering from the inside. Meanwhile, the police, frustrated but not defeated, saw opportunity in the gang's weakness. They increased surveillance, hoping that the growing cracks would lead to mistakes. For the first time in years, there was a sense that the Iron Fists might not be unbreakable after all. Yet, Crow remained unshaken. To the outside world, his rule looked as firm as ever. He continued to expand operations, continued to collect money, and continued to spread fear. But behind the walls of secrecy, the foundation was beginning to rot. The Iron Fists were still Scotland's most feared gang, but beneath the surface, betrayal and distrust were tearing them apart. The empire that once seemed eternal was no longer as solid as the shadows believed. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. By 2012, the legend of the Iron Fists had reached its peak, but every empire built on fear eventually begins to crumble. The gang still controlled large sections of Glasgow, but the cracks that had appeared after the betrayal had only deepened. Rival groups, once too afraid to challenge Crow, sensed weakness. The most determined of them came from Edinburgh, a gang with its own ambitions to control the drug routes feeding into Scotland. Their attacks were sudden and brutal, targeting warehouses, vehicles, and men loyal to the Iron Fists. For the first time in more than a decade, Crow's dominance was openly challenged, and blood spilled across city streets that had once been silent under his command. At the same time, the police were no longer stumbling in the dark. Years of frustration had built into a inside the gang, paranoia turned into open conflict. Lieutenants who had once sat silently at Crow's side now argued openly about money, loyalty, and strategy. Some disappeared suddenly, either eliminated by Crow himself or fleeing to avoid what they believed was an inevitable collapse. Trust, the foundation of the gang's power, had completely disintegrated. What remained was not a disciplined organization but a fractured collection of men trying desperately to cling to a fading rain. In the middle of this chaos, Crow himself became a ghost. Reports of his presence grew less frequent. Some claimed he had fled Scotland, using false documents to escape to Spain, where retired criminals often vanished into luxury villas on the coast. Others whispered that he had been betrayed by someone within his own circle, executed in secret, and buried in the remote highlands, his grave hidden where no one would ever stumble across it. The police searched relentlessly, raiding property after property, but Crow was nowhere to be found. His name remained on every officer's lips, yet his face was never seen again. The disappearance of Crow marked the true end of the Iron Fists. Without their leader, the gang crumbled in months. Those who weren't arrested scattered into smaller groups, too weak to dominate the city as they once had. Some turned on each other, some fled abroad, and others faded quietly into obscurity. The empire that had once ruled Glasgow like an invisible government was reduced to nothing more than scattered fragments of memory. For the people of Glasgow, life began to change. The fear that had hung in the air for years lifted slowly, replaced by cautious relief. Businesses reopened, streets grew busier, and for the first time in a decade, conversations in pubs no longer fell silent at the mention of the Iron Fists. Yet, the shadow of what had happened lingered. Crow's body was never found, and rumors about his fate continued to swirl. Some believed he was still alive, planning a return. Others thought his silence was proof of his death. The uncertainty only deepened the legend. In the end, the Iron Fists did not fall because of a single raid, a rival gang, or one act of betrayal. They fell because power built on fear cannot last forever. Distrust, ambition, and the weight of their own violence consumed them from within. What began as a small group of young men hungry for control became Scotland's most feared gang, and then vanished almost as quickly as they had risen. Their name lives on only in whispers and stories, a warning etched into the memory of Glasgow that even the strongest shadows eventually disappear.